Welcome to the podcast of Rogue Valley Christian Church, located in Medford, Oregon. We strive to be a people who gather together to connect the unconnected to Jesus, grow together in full devotion to God, and serve the world with Him.
If you got a Bible, if you brought one, you can turn to the book of Joshua chapter 10. If you didn't bring one, you can open it up maybe on your smartphone or something like that, or you can grab the Bible that's underneath the seat in front of you. We're going to look at Joshua 10, 11, and 12 today, and I know that might cause you to think we're going to be here forever, or there's no way in the world that's possible. You just wait and see. But as we do, I thought it was worthwhile to mention that as we're going through this Old Testament book called Joshua, that is a narrative style of writing, simply recording the events and moments and battles, if you will, as it relates to Joshua, of God's people, it's very, very important that we do not disconnect the book of Joshua from the gospel. And here's what I mean by that. We hear the gospel and we start thinking about, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, whoever believe in Him would not perish but have everlasting life. But it's important for us to understand that the gospel is all that God was doing from Genesis all the way through Revelation in terms of making what went wrong right again and doing that forevermore. And the book of Joshua is actually a part of that process. And not just that big overarching process, but it's absolutely important as it relates to the arrival of Jesus on the scene years later. You know, we read it and we kind of compartmentalize different stories of like, oh, this happened then and this happened there. And sometimes we forget that, no, this is all a part of what God is doing. You see, when God spoke and promised a Savior all the way back in Genesis and then began to reveal how that would work and what it would look like even in promises to Abraham and then continuing all the way through the Old Testament, it was very clear to the people of God that His Son or His Savior, the one that would come and make all things right again, would come to a specific land. Throughout the Old Testament prophets, they speak to where Jesus would actually arrive and where He would do ministry and what that would look like. Well, just as it relates to Jesus and the gospel, it's important to remember that the book of Joshua is the accounting, it's the telling of the story of how God's people actually took possession of that land, not just as a people, but took possession of that land where the Son of God would arrive. You see, it's inseparably connected to the gospel, and we have to see it that way. It's got to be more than just battles and bad people, good people and not so great people. It's got to be more than just generals and armies. It's got to be more than that. We've got to connect it to the overarching story of God's great love for the world that even so often doesn't necessarily recognize Him or even deserve it, but He keeps giving it. Last week, if you were here, you remember Josh actually was teaching through Joshua, and he taught through chapter 9 with the Gibeonites, who were actually neighbors, if you will, to where the Israelites were starting to get a foothold in the land. And the Gibeonites recognized, well, wait a minute, these people, something significant's going on with these people. They're winning battles that are beyond them or above them, so to speak. There's something going on here, and if we're not careful, they're going to take over us. So the Gibeonites devised this great ruse, if you will, to dress up and pretend like they were from far away, and as a result, the Israelites made a covenant with them. If you weren't here last week, I highly recommend going on the podcast, checking that message out. It's very encouraging because there was a reminder, even through Joshua chapter 9, that even in the middle of whatever our messiness is, and don't you know we all have it, messiness and middles. I thought that was funny. It wasn't, but I just thought it was funny. my middle is changing shape fast, right? So maybe that's my problem. One could say that my middle is becoming a mess. So it's even there, it's even there that God can actually work and bring something positive out. And you know, in that story, as Josh taught last week, that God ultimately gets honored by people keeping their word, by people trusting in him. And I want to encourage you to do that. Well, as we move to Joshua chapter 10, Joshua chapter 11, Joshua chapter 12, we're still connected to this group of people called the Gibeonites. You see, the Gibeonites, when they made this treaty with Israel, and they, if you will, went into partnership with them, historically, we know this, the Gibeonites would eventually, they'll show up, if you will, in the book of Nehemiah. I was going to say Numbers, but that's not. And then I was going to say, what's that book where they rebuilt the walls? Do you guys remember? Nehemiah, thank you. You're supposed to help there, not just look at me like I'm an idiot. But in the book of Nehemiah, the Gibeonites show back up, and they're actually helping the Israelites rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so from there, you recognize that the Gibeonites, in their treaty and partnership with Israel, they actually begin to just be assimilated into the people of God, which is an interesting thing. Well, that was a blessing for them. But remember, there were other people living in the land at that time as well. And they didn't see the action of the Gibeonites as something positive. In fact, they saw it as negative, though they were all individual. At this time, the writing of the book of Joshua, or the story of the book of Joshua, Israelite was filled with city-states, if you will. And there were kings over these little kingdoms. Some of the kingdoms were tiny. Remember Jericho, the kingdom or the city or the area of Jericho really took up only about 6 acres. Just for reference, that's the size of the church property. It was about 6 acres, right? And some of them were larger than that, upwards of 300-400 acres in size. But within Israel at this time, there's lots of these city-states, the Gibeonites being one of them. They make a treaty with Israel. Well, the other city-states around them saw their actions as an act of treason. Even though they weren't united together, they were in the same place in that they were going to stand firm and hold their ground against these foreign intruders known as the Israelites. This is the way they would have seen it. And so they would have seen the actions of the Gibeonites in making a treaty with the Israelites. It's a lot of ites. They would have seen that as an act of treason. And so as a result, there are 5 kings in the book of Joshua, chapter 10. Look at verse 1. It says, as soon as Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted it to destruction, doing to Ai as its king had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, and Japhiah, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, come up to me and help me, and let us strike down Gibeon. So in Joshua chapter 10, here's what happens. This Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem isn't taken by God's people yet. Like, we hear Jerusalem and we think the centerpiece of the religious world, the centerpiece of Jewish culture and spirituality. Not yet. Not until under the rule and reign of King David does Israel actually inhabit and take over Jerusalem. In this time, Jerusalem was just another city-state. And so the leader of that city-state goes to the other leaders around them, these other 5 kings, and says, hey, let's unite against this treason of the Gibeonites and wipe them out. Let's take their town. What they've done is not good for us. Well, here's what happens. The Gibeonites send word to Joshua, and they say, hey, we need your help. Remember, we have a treaty, and we need your help. They're going to come and attack us. And Joshua, the people inquire of the Lord, and he goes down, and he leads the Israelites to victory over these 5 kings, to the point to where they're chasing the kings out of the country, so to speak. The kings run for their lives, end up hiding in a cave, and Joshua says, while they're trapped in the cave, just put some big rocks over it till we wait and figure out what to do. And so when they realize what they need to do, they remove the rocks, they pull the kings out. Joshua has them executed. This is brutal, by the way. He has them executed But first, before he executes the kings, he has his generals place their feet on their necks. Which, by the way, if you read that, you're like, wait, what? When you read that, you have to understand in a time of war, it was indicative. That action would have communicated that we are in charge and you have been beaten down. And it would have sent a message to not only the person whose neck was trapped under a foot, but everybody watching. It was humiliating. So then he has the kings executed, hangs them in a tree till evening, pulls them down from the tree. Again, it's a message to all the people around there, and it's brutal. Pulls them down from the tree, puts them back in the cave, puts the rocks over it as this big kind of tomb. And if that's not enough, then decides, okay, now let's go take their towns. They have no leader. So Joshua leads the children of Israel, the people of Israel, and they overtake all of those towns. So here's the interesting thing as we look at this. And not only do they overtake all of those towns, they end up taking out, you remember the giants in the land that the spies were afraid of all those years ago? Well, they end up taking them all out as well, except for the ones in Gath, which will come back to play when we study the life of David, which we'll do within the next decade. Because after this, when we're done with the book of Joshua, right around the beginning of September, we're going to study through the book of Romans. That will take nearly a decade. And then we'll get to David. I'm just kidding. It won't take a decade, but it will take some time. But that's where we're going. But as we look at this in Joshua chapter 10, this is what happens. And so in chapter 11, then, the people that are, so in chapter 10, all of this is communicating. The writer and the person who's narrating this story of God's people is wanting God's people that would have been reading it. Did you know that the first readers of the book of Joshua were not West Coast Christian Americans? Right. They weren't. But that's going to come into play later because sometimes we read it as if this is all about us and only us, right? Lord, I need something from your word. And so we read this and we come up with, well, here's how to deal with our enemies, right? Well, the problem is God has not called any one of us, just so you know, in case there's any doubt, he has not called any of us to execute our neighbors. He hasn't called any of us to take our foot and place it on their necks. He has not called any of us to hang them from a tree or put them in a cave. Are you guys clear with that? In fact, he actually has called us in the New Testament not to fight a war with our neighbors, but to go in love to our neighbors. Do you see how that's different? And that's why I bring up that the first readers of this were not necessarily West Coast Christians in America. They would have been Israelites, the sons and daughters of this generation that would have been reading about and hearing the stories of their history. And they would have understood, oh, this is not only how we got here, but this is why we're here. Which, by the way, they would forget and they would lose sight of all the time. And I suggest to you, so do we, don't we? Do you ever lose sight as you're mowing your lawn that you don't want to mow? Do you ever lose sight of how you got to have that lawn? You know what I mean? I don't like mowing lawns. And I just admit that. I don't like mowing lawns. And so every time I'm mowing my lawn, right? Every time I'm mowing my lawn, I'm like, why am I doing this? It's not even any fun. I don't have the right tools. I don't have edge. I don't have an edge on my lawn. I just have lawn that spills over to the sidewalk, and it just spills over and lays down. It doesn't lay up, so it never gets cut, and it's like 7 feet long over the sidewalk. But I don't have an edger, and I'm not going to cut it with scissors like my other neighbor. So I just look at it in futility going, why? But yesterday, my brother-in-law's in town, and I got a new mower. I got a battery-operated mower. And for those of you who only do gas, don't judge me. My carbon footprint is very small. So I had this battery-operated mower, which is amazing. And my brother-in-law's like, I got to check out your mower. Because that's what dudes do. Right? We have a hot tub. No, let's look at the mower. So he gets the mower, and he's mowing the lawn, and there's a point where I'm just watching him mow the lawn. It looked creepy, but it wasn't. I was just watching him mow my lawn. And in my mind, this is going somewhere. In my mind, as he's mowing the lawn, I had this great sense of gratitude for the story of how I got that lawn. Which then turned into thinking about, and I'll just be honest, I've been studying all of this all week, so I'm not super spiritual as I spit all over the floor. I've been studying all of this, so I was like super grateful for not only how I got the lawn, but then I realized why I have that lawn. It's not so I have the greatest edged lawn. It'll never happen unless somebody comes and does it for me, right? Why I have that lawn is that I might actually have conversations with my neighbors. I might actually say hey to my neighbors. I might actually share the gospel and have love for my neighbors. Do you see what I mean? And it's really easy for us to lose sight of it, just like it was for the Israelites. But chapter 10 describes how they capture the southern region of the promised land. And then chapter 11, it describes how they capture the northern region. Look at chapter 11, verse 1. It says this: when Jabin, king of Hatzor, and I would encourage you, by the way, to go back this week and read all of chapter 10, all of chapter 11, and all of chapter 12, and let it kind of sink in. But in chapter 11, verse 1, it says, when Jabin, king of Hatzor, heard of the Israelites' victory over the southern region, he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country, and in the Arabah, south of the Chinneroth, and in the lowland, I'm just not able to pronounce these words very well. But do you guys read them in your minds? In Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites of the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out with all their troops, a great horde, in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Chapter 11, we're told that these city-states in the north unite as a result of hearing what happened in the south. They unite to fight against Israel. Just so you know, the skirmish that we just read about in the south was manageable. What we're reading about that happens as a result of that in the north is absolutely overwhelming. Because if you caught that, the writer describes that all of them and their armies, he calls them a great horde, and they have many horses and chariots, and it says that the numbers of fighting men were like the sands of the sea. In other words, standing right opposed to Israel, right at the edge of their camp, so to speak, is this great number of people from the northern region of the Promised Land, basically stating to Israel, you may take the south, but you will not have the north. And what happens is the Lord speaks to Joshua, and he says, be strong and courageous. I have given all of these people into your hands, and here I will give you victory over them. And then chapter 11 just records victory after victory after victory that Joshua leads the people over. All of those kings that I just struggled to read, Joshua tracks them down and gains a great victory. Then you move to chapter 12, and in chapter 12 you get an accounting for, again, remember, you're the great-great-granddaughter or grandson of one of the Israelites who lived during the time of Joshua. You're wondering how you got here and why you're here. And your culture exists in such a way that the stories of your people are passed on over and over and over around campfires and through the reading of scrolls and animal skins. And it's important that you understand the stories of your past. It's important that you understand who you are and why you are as a people. And so the people of God would have told these stories over and over and over. And if you were the great-great-granddaughter or grandson of one of the Israelites who lived during the time of this great campaign led by Joshua, you would have read in chapter 12 that this is the people that God, through his people, conquered. These are the kings and these are the kingdoms. And you would have been affected by not only this story, but specifically these chapters. Here's what I mean. When we read through this, and I recognize we've kind of done an overview through these chapters, and that's okay. But I recognize that as we read these chapters, if you're anything like me, I just want to cut to the chase, so to speak. Does anybody else, when doing your daily Bible reading, is there anybody else who has a clock ticking in the back of your head? Like, I just need to get through this so I can check it off my list. And what's this mean to me? And how is this supposed to affect my life? Do you guys work through that? And if you do, then I suggest to you, these chapters are kind of confusing because how do these ancient battles that were led by God, where he moved heaven and earth on behalf of his people, where he intervened miraculously on behalf of his people, where he gave his people that were outnumbered greatly miraculous victory, how do these chapters that list these 30 plus kings that God and his people overcame, how does this affect us? And I got to admit, we could do this. We could say, okay, so it's important as Christians in the struggles and wars that we face, it's important for us to be more courageous and to be more faithful. Amen? And it is, and I get that, but I can't just say, hey, be more faithful. You, falling asleep in the third row, be more courageous, right? I can't just say that here because it doesn't work. Do you know how I know that it doesn't work? Because church history throughout the ages, particularly American church history throughout the ages, has communicated that kind of stuff hasn't worked. Why? Because we're still struggling with faith, and I don't know about you, but I'm still afraid a lot of the time. Like, I still live my life struggling. Okay, well, let's not go towards that. Let's warn people. Hey! All of you West Coast Americans, don't be prideful or arrogant. Because that's what was going on with all of these people warring against God, right? In their own arrogance, they're saying, no. We have our life and we have our way, and there's nobody that's going to change it. Well, that's as prideful and arrogant as it gets, isn't it? So we could say that. We could say, okay, be more courageous, be more faithful, be less prideful, and be less arrogant. God bless you. Pray for one another on your way out and have a great day. Right? Well, we would, just so you know, we would all walk away and maybe we would be encouraged for like 35 minutes. But the time we get home and we start thinking about things, we would think this, wait a minute, I've heard that over and over and over and over, and yet I still struggle. Because I think sometimes we forget what should motivate any kind of change that God sees necessary. And I believe that what motivates more humility, what motivates less arrogance, what motivates courage, what motivates faith, what motivates trust, what motivates obedience is a deeper understanding of who God is. It's a deeper understanding of who God is. It's not just a churchy list of rules and regulations to follow. It is a deeper understanding of who God is. And if you were one of those Israelites that were related to the Israelites that lived this out in real life, if you were a generation removed and you were sitting around a campfire and your great-grandfather was telling you the stories, what he would have told you is this: we learned, witnessed, and experienced the greatness of God during this campaign. The greatness of God. Joshua chapter 10, the greatness of a God who can command creation on behalf of his people in order to accomplish his purposes and plans. In Joshua chapter 10, it actually says he rained down hail upon the people, and more people died from the hail that came from heaven than did by the swords of the Israelites. In Joshua chapter 10, he has the sun stand still, which we know scientifically is the earth and all the solar system just slowing down. Like, this is what God does. In Joshua chapter 11, we read of a God who is greater than any kind of wickedness that is in the world. And I'll get there in a moment, but it's important for us to realize and remember that all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 9, God commanded his people that they were going to go into the land, and what he was going to do with them was drive out these wicked people, and no amount, just so you know, God is greater than any kind of wickedness that we see in the world, and no amount of it will stop his purposes and his plans to bring about salvation to the world. Does that make sense? Joshua chapter 12, his people would have understood, wait a minute, God is greater than any king or kingdom that we can imagine. Not only if it's a little city state or this big conglomeration of states, they will not overwhelm or come against or thwart or stop the purposes and plans of God. He's greater than that. And the people of Israel, the Israelites, as they experienced this, and if they could have connected not just what had happened, but who happened it. Do you guys see what I mean? If they would have been able to connect the who happened all of what happened, then they would have understood, then wait a minute. They would have, if you will, gained more confidence in who their God was. Because he can move heaven and earth on our behalf. How would that have affected the Israelites? It would have given them great confidence in who God was and what he could do, even with creation. It would have brought about a deeper reverence, because they were reminded that what God was doing in chapter 11 by driving all of these people out and actually judging them for their wickedness, whether we like that description or not, whether we get it or not, I only reference you back a few weeks where we talked about the judgment of God, that it is not from earth, but it is from heaven. And because it's from heaven, it comes from a perfect place and a perfect perspective. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he can judge perfectly every circumstance, every situation, every individual. And whether we like it or not, some are going to end up on the wrong side of that judgment, but he's perfect in doing so, yes? And if he wasn't, then he wouldn't be God. But because he's God, he can, and so he does. And this would have, I suggest you, brought about a deeper sense of reverence in the hearts of God's people. Why? Because they would see and they would recognize, oh, wait a minute, wickedness has consequences. There's a price to be paid for evil, so to speak. And I highly recommend, if you've never done this, I highly recommend doing some research and historical study on the religions, the pagan religions of the Canaanites during this time. It was horrific. And so God judges it. And the people of God would have recognized and understood, wait a minute, this isn't just on our behalf. We're actually instruments of what God is doing in this world, which is not allowing wickedness and evil to go on forever. And it would have, I suggest to you, it should have brought about a deeper sense of reverence in people's hearts. It would have also, chapter 12, as they recognize, wait a minute, God overcomes kings and kingdoms, and none of them will stand against him. It would have no doubt produced a generational, or should have produced a generational perseverance in who God was, knowing that kingdoms will rise and fall, but God will still stand with his people and bring about everything that he's doing. You see, this would have affected these people in profound ways. It would have brought out a group of people that walked with the Lord more confidently, therefore obeying the Lord. Why? Because he can move heaven and earth to accomplish all of his purposes and plans. It would have brought about a people who would walk more humbly before God. Why? Because they recognize, wait a minute, we don't just do what we want, and evil doesn't get to just be. Wickedness doesn't just get to happen. They would have managed their behavior, so to speak, in a recognition of how holy God is, something that I think that we miss these days. Furthermore, no matter what enemy was knocking at their gates, there would have been a sense of perseverance. Why? Because ultimately God can and will never be overcome by any earthly king or kingdom. So then, what about us? How do we work through this? Well, I suggest this. I suggest we do the same thing as we read these chapters, as we peruse these passages, as we kind of look over them, we recognize the same things, that these, first and foremost, communicate the greatness of God. That is, he is transcendent. That is, he is above and beyond all other things. All other things, both living and non-living, organic and natural. He's above all of it. He transcends it. And in chapter 10, if he moves heaven and earth, if he causes, listen, I'll just read it. Chapter 10, verse 11. It says that the people fled before Israel, and while they were going down the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. And at that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in that day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Aijalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. This is Joshua chapter 10. God transcending, being greater than even creation, and in so actually using creation to accomplish his purposes and plans. I suggest to you that as the creator of everything, that God maintains the ability to command anything in order to accomplish his purposes and plans. In Colossians chapter 1, we're told that that in Jesus, all things are held together, and not just held together, but are used for his glory. They are not only held together and used, they are for him. See, the Lord's transcendence or greatness over even creation should be a great cause of confidence. We too can obey his leading, knowing that he who can make the sun stand still can move anything and everything according to his will. First service, this was a moment. I'm just going to share it with you. Are you okay with that? So I had this moment first service. I read that sentence. You guys know where I got that sentence? From my brain. So here's the deal. What you should say to me right after service is, Darrin, you need to be less arrogant. So, first service, I said this. Wow, that's a profound. Listen, he who can make the sun stand still can move everything and anything according to his will. Like, there's something about God being greater than and transcending even creation that should affect us. I had this moment where I thought, okay, so what does that mean then? What does that mean? Well, if you're like me, it means this. Okay, Lord, I need you to do some moving of some heaven and earth to make my life a little more comfortable. Because there are some situations I'm facing that I need you to adjust. There are people in my life that I need you to rearrange. There are financial situations. There are fences. There are realities in my life on the outside that I need you to move and bring forth your power in my heaven and my earth so that I can be more comfortable. You see, I read these things and I hear these things and I think outside in selfishly, but could it be that what that is all really about is inside out selflessly? You see, because here's the thing. If God reveals himself in Joshua chapter 10 as the one who can move heaven and earth, anything, in order to accomplish his purposes and plans, then the real question is not, God, can you move this stuff around me? The real question is, are we going to allow God to move within me? Because if he'll move within us, then we will actually, in light of who he is, be more apt to obey him, right? Because if we open up and say, Lord, the issues that I need moved in my life, the heaven and earth that I need you to, the creation and the cosmos and the everything that I need you to rearrange so that I think that I could live more better, is not out here, ladies and gentlemen. I suggest to you it might be in here. But there's hope in this. Because if he can move heaven and earth, and if he can command creation, then he can transform your mind, my mind, your heart, and my heart. And when he does, guess what happens? We actually begin to move according to his will. We not only gain confidence in who he is, but it's a confidence that leads to obedience. Why? Because of what he does. If there's nothing that he can't manage for his purpose and plans, then that includes you and me. And that includes, just so you know, I'll be personal, that includes my own messed up mind. That includes my own selfish will. That includes my own dastardly desires. That would have been fun to write down. It includes all of that. And if he can move all of that, well, guess what's going to happen in my life? It gets moved. Moved where? More in line with his purposes and plans. Where I'm more apt to go and love my neighbor and not fight with them. Does that make sense? Chapter 11, here's an interesting thing. In chapter 11, I just want to read a verse to you. It's hard, by the way. Chapter 11, verse 20. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, all these kings in the north who arrayed or came together to fight against the Israelites. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. It's a very hard verse to come across. I mean, we can just read it in our daily devotion and just read over it. But if we really think about it, what God is saying is this, is that he gave people over. It's Romans chapter 1. It's also the same thing that he did with Pharaoh. He gave people over to their own hardened hearts that they might get what they really wanted, which was nothing to do with God. Does that make sense? That's a very quick way of describing this very huge thing. But he did so because of wickedness. So here's the important thing for you and I. It's important to recognize that just as much as God transcends creation, he is also greater than any wickedness that we might witness in our world. And this is super hopeful for me. Yesterday, I was scrolling through my phone, and I was looking at news feed after news feed after news feed. And I'm telling you, every other story, one, is about what's happening with the Kardashians. So if you throw those out, then you go, every other story is about some horrific thing that is happening in the world around us. And when I say horrific thing that's happening, I'm talking about, it's about somebody being hurt. It's about somebody being murdered. It's about somebody being sold. It's about somebody being used. It's about somebody being bought. It's about somebody being mistreated. It's about somebody being marginalized. It's about somebody being devalued. It's about somebody somewhere being less than what they were meant to be made. And I don't know about you, but it does not take too much stretch of the imagination to connect all of that negativity and those somebodies being used and abused. It doesn't take too much to connect it to some sort of wickedness happening in the world around us. And the wickedness, by the way, is God's word, not mine. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, he tells God's people, I'm going to use you to drive these people out and judge their wickedness. And I don't know about you, but yesterday, man, when I'm scrolling through the news and every other story is revealing some sort of wickedness that is wiping people out, hurting people, destroying people, killing people, taking people's hope, robbing people of their joy, robbing people of their money and lives. Every other story gets a little overwhelming for me. I can protect myself in my own little house, in my own little neighborhood, in my own little mile that I go to my own little church, in my own little state called Oregon. Man, if you get up and out of all of this, you recognize even in our own little Oregon, even in our own little towns, even in our own little streets, there's all kinds of people suffering. And what chapter 11 is a reminder of is this: God transcends that. He is greater than that, and it will not go on forever. He will not allow it to go on forever. He will bring it to an end. There will be a day that he wipes away every tear from every eye. Like Joshua chapter 11 is a reminder, ladies and gentlemen. It's a reminder to have hope. It's a reminder to know that he will do what he said he's going to do. But it's also a challenge, in the meantime, to be reverent. Don't give in and give over. But recognize, wait a minute, he does recognize. God sees right and wrong. And as his people, we should live according to what he says is right, which comes from a heart that recognizes he is greater than we are, and we revere him for it. In other words, we don't get puffed up with pride and arrogance, but we bow down in humility and say, oh God, not only do I need your help in my world, but I need your help in my life. Have your way within me. It's a reminder for reverence. It's a reminder for hopeful reverence. Chapter 12, where he overwhelms, there's this long list of kings and kingdoms that he overwhelms, communicates that God is greater than and transcends all kings and kingdoms. And if he rules over the nations, he maintains the authority to establish and or remove any king or kingdom for the purpose of establishing his rule on earth, even as it is in heaven. God's transcendence over kings and their kingdoms should be a cause for our perseverance, because we know that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. And one day, everything that is wrong in our world will be made right again, which, by the way, is the story of the Scriptures. It is the gospel. It is what God is doing. The encouragement today as we consider these passages, people, is to recognize how great God he is and be confident in him. Confident that a confidence that leads to trust and obedience. To recognize how great God is, stay away from sin, and embrace reverence, embrace humility, embrace the hope that comes in that. It's a reminder to recognize how great God is and know that it doesn't matter, listen, I'm just going to get into this. It doesn't matter what political parties are saying or arguing or winning or losing or what's going on politically. It doesn't matter what's going on socially. It doesn't matter what's going on with this king or that kingdom. In the end, they will all bow down and confess that Jesus is Lord. And when that happens, everything that is wrong will be made right. In the meantime, we persevere. We persevere faithfully. We say, okay, Lord, then how would you have my life to be arranged, even as it relates to politics, even as it relates to social justice, even as it relates to what's happening in our culture? How would you have my life actually tell the story of people who persevere in the name of Jesus Christ for his purposes, his plans, and his glory in this world? That means this: he becomes greater and we become less. That's what happens, and we trust that no matter what happens in the world around us, no matter who's rising or who's falling, God will ultimately have his way. So we hold on. We don't give up. Somebody asked me the other day, I didn't know this, but somebody came to me and said, hey, this morning, it wasn't the other day, it was this morning, somebody came to me and said, hey, I watched a movie that you're in. And I was like, oh, well, I am a professional actor. Southern Oregon Subaru paid me to do a commercial. A buddy of mine, when I ran my first 50-mile ultra, made a movie of it, and apparently it's on YouTube. I'm not going to tell you where or what it's called. Somebody came to me today and they said, I just watched that movie. You ran 50 miles. I said, in fairness, I didn't run all 50 of them. I walked quite a few. Are you with me? And they were like, how in the world do you do that? And I said, you take one step at a time and you don't ever give up. You take one step at a time and you don't ever stop. That's how you finish them. And then I was reminded, here, you're going to like this, as I walk across the stage in pride. So I got that mantra going through my head, take one step at a time and never give up. I'm Darrin Ray Ratcliffe. I don't quit. So back in May, I did my second 50-miler, and guess what happened? I quit after 41 miles. I couldn't take one more step. And I realized that dropping out of the race was not actually quitting, just calling it a day. See, the point for you and I is this: take one step at a time and just don't ever give up on God. Joshua chapter 12 is a call to persevere by faith, knowing that no matter how confusing this world and this life is, God will make it all make sense again someday.